on the battlefield. We may already have passed the point, past tense, where there was any chance to have a negotiated settlement that was on any terms that would be acceptable to both sides. That was maybe always a bridge too far, but it was something at least President Trump was trying to do. But there was an issue going on from the beginning that he had a chance to offload this before it became his war. He said so many times here in last couple of weeks, especially, that this was Biden's war. It's not anything I started. It wouldn't have happened if I'd have been involved, but I'm going to get it solved here. We have been saying that there's a chance for him to successfully do that. And we've had Colonel Douglas McGregor on several times giving him the formula for how he would be able to avoid having it be on his watch. But I believe, Doug, we are now past that point. It is now firmly in Donald Trump's ownership.
Well, I think it is in the sense that people in the United States will see it that way, unfortunately, those that care. But the truth is, we are non-players in this operation. And Donald Trump's sort of scoring win with Zelensky and signing on for this mineral access is, an empty victory. That will vanish with Zelensky, let's be frank. And I think Zelensky is scheduled to vanish. The second thing is that it promised, as a matter of reciprocity, American military assistance. That went over like a lead balloon in Moscow. They didn't miss it. President Putin brought it up. It's an utter catastrophe, because to this point we have been talking to the Russians about a neutral Ukraine, which would not involve any military assistance from the United States or NATO. So I think the opportunity to close this out in a dignified manner, to finally extricate the United States from what has really been an atrocity, this entire war, has been lost. So I don't know what will happen next, except that I think it'll be decided, as we've always said, by the Russians.
And look, I think that there was a real possibility of at least getting the United States out of this, and by extension, if the U.S. did what you suggested several times on our show over the last couple of months, that he should just cut off the supplies, withdraw American forces, and say, we're out of this. You guys have to figure this out. That sounded draconian and mean, I guess, if you even want to use that term on the surface of it. But I think that practically speaking, that was the absolute most moral, effective thing that Trump could have done, even though it would have gotten a lot of people unhappy at the beginning. But then the war could be coming closer to an end, and the killing actually stopped, which was his objective. But instead, after making some comments, I think it was on the 18th or 20th of April, the Trump administration officials started saying more and more, we're going to end this war. We have days left to get this done. And if it doesn't work, then we're willing to walk. And it looked like Trump was actually going to do that. But that didn't happen. And this past weekend on Meet the Press, Trump was asked pointedly about that very issue.
The Secretary of State told me this is a very critical week. Are you any closer to reaching a peace agreement between Ukraine and Russia?
I hope so.
How would you characterize
I do believe we're closer with one party and maybe not as close with the other, but...
How long do you give both countries before you're going to walk away?
Well, there'll be a time when I will say, okay, keep going, keep being stupid.
When does that come? Are you close to it?
Sometimes I get close to it and then positive things happen, okay? So I hope it gets done.
Yeah, that's. I tell you, Doug, I got some concerns about this so-called positive things that have been happening. But what do you make of his answers there about when will this point come?
Well, he should simply say that we've already done all that we can, and there is no willingness on the part of Mr. Zelensky to arrive at any sort of solution. Zelensky wants the impossible. He wants the Russians to essentially withdraw from Ukraine, give back Crimea, get on their knees and beg forgiveness of Zelensky. Well, that's absurd. That's not going to happen. It's absolutely insane. And that's what the president should say. This notion of sitting there and saying, well, you know, maybe then somehow, okay, something good happens here now and again. It's a waste of his time. We have interests, but they are not in Ukraine. We have an interest in stability and peace, an end to the conflict. We will support that. But Zelensky doesn't want that. If he refuses to do that, then we're out. And he should get us out. We don't need to be there. We don't need to waste any more time, money, or resources on Ukraine. We already have the Inspector General telling us that 50% of everything we've sent has effectively been lost in corruption. You know, we're finding members of the drug cartels, their armed elements walking around with Javelin missiles. What else do we have to do before we finally say enough? So I don't know who is advising the president, but he's not getting good advice. And we look like a teenager on TikTok. You know, we go through one video, oh, that's nice. No, we don't like that. We go to another one. You know, this is not the art of the deal. International relations don't lend themselves to transactional outcomes. The art of diplomacy is the art of the possible. If it's not possible, we should walk and be done with it. Because in the final analysis, we have no vital strategic interest in Ukraine.
And, you know, you mentioned the point there, the very, very poignant question. I don't know who's advising him. Well, apparently Mike Waltz is no longer advising him, so that's off the table. But now then, just some didn't make a lot of the mainstream media news, but there was some news come out here. This here is from the I believe it's the Kiev Independent, where a pastor went to apparently Trump's personal pastor went to Ukraine and was given a briefing, and he comes back and says that the U.S. will not turn its back on Ukraine. And he goes on to say in this article that he was taken to the battlefront and showed many of the atrocities of the Russian Federation. There was a time, Doug, you may recall, shortly after that debacle in late February in the White House, in the Oval Office, when Zelensky got into a shouting match with the president and the vice president, and he's made a comment in there, have you been to Ukraine? Come and we'll show you the situation. Now, I know some people in the administration that said it's absurd that Trump is not going to go to Ukraine to see the dog and pony show that Vice President Vance correctly pointed out. But this pastor did, and he's a pastor. He may be a wonderful human being, but he knows nothing about international relations and was absolutely played and was shown all these things, and he believes them all. Then he goes back, and there's a picture of him on Air Force One with Trump, as it appears, where he's got his ear, and then he tells him this thing, and then things start to happen after that fact. And it just looks to me, you talk about a TikTok situation, it looks to me like Trump allowed this pastor to talk him into something to change his idea from what he was saying on the 18th of April.
Well, I'm not entirely surprised because President Trump, unfortunately, has frequently been most influenced by the last person who spoke to him. And he's far too emotional. And showing him pictures of dead children or something like that has a profound impact. That's one of the ways that we got involved in Syria with the various missile strikes. The rationale for them was entirely illicit and bogus. But nevertheless, he reacted in such a way. What's interesting to me is that he reacts in this fashion to what is clearly staged in Ukraine. The Ukrainians have become masters, with a lot of help from the West, at staging atrocities, staging massacres, things that they actually executed themselves. Bucha being the best example. But apparently Gaza doesn't penetrate. The mass murder and expulsion of people from Gaza, now mass murder through starvation, something which the NKVD practiced for 2 decades, killing millions inside the old Soviet Union. That seems to be the practice now in Israel. That doesn't penetrate. That doesn't even make it into the mainstream media. And as a result, President Trump doesn't seem to be in the least moved by those facts. It's beyond me. It's just, frankly, the whole thing is amateur hour. There's nothing professional about anything happening in the White House or inside Washington these days.
So let's talk about some of the ramifications of this on the other half of this equation from the Russian side. So we had the phone call with Trump and Putin. We've had the multiple, I think, 3 different visits from Steve Witkoff to Putin, and they're saying that they're close to a situation. You may recall it was now more than 2 weeks ago that Witkoff said, "I think we're really, really close to having an agreement that both we and the Russians agree to, and then we need to see if we can get Zelensky and Europe on board, etc." But then there's been some changes since that time. There was in just the last few days an agreement, and I don't know if this was exactly after or before this pastor went to Ukraine, but now all of a sudden we're given a $350 million support package for F-16 training and support, which obviously has nothing to do with in finding a negotiated settlement. There is a let's see, it was a $50 million deal for other military aid. There was a new air defense missiles from Patriots that have been now offered in there. So all of this looks like we're increasing our aid. Now, if you're on the Russian side of this and you've been talking to the White House and the administration on coming to a negotiated settlement that understands the core causes of this, as the Russians put it, if Trump started off by saying, "Hey, I understand that NATO was a big issue. That's one of the reasons they went to war, etc." But now all of a sudden you see this. Are we closer or further away from having an agreement?
Well, first of all, I'm not sure that President Trump understands the implications of such an aid package. I don't know how much he knows about it. I mean, obviously, the people in Washington that are tied to the defense industries are going to cheer this on because this means money once again for the American defense establishment, defense industrial establishment. But it effectively spoils any opportunity that we have to normalize our relations with Russia. And I thought normalizing relations with Moscow was something that President Trump wanted to achieve. It's in the interest of everyone for us to have normalized relations with the Russians. So again, this is all very disappointing. But if you're a Russian watching this, if you're President Putin, you sort of shake your head, but this is not really a surprise because remember, just a few weeks ago, President Putin warned the leaders of Russia's economy and industrial capacity that he didn't expect anything positive from the West. He didn't expect any sanctions to be lifted. He didn't seem to think that the people that are in charge are ultimately in charge. In other words, that whatever we see as a government is a facade behind which there are other more powerful forces. And I don't know what you call those donors, billionaire oligarchs, whatever, that are actually making the decisions. And this just tends to confirm his suspicion. And his point to the people in his country who are involved in the private sector was very straightforward. We have to become increasingly self-reliant, and we have to turn our attention to other markets in Asia, beyond the United States, to the global South, because the United States and Europe are just not reliable partners anymore. And I think that's what he's concluding now.
There's this thought out there that moves like this, like the air defense missiles, the F-16, et cetera, and Zelensky is the biggest cheerleader of this, and it's echoed by many in Europe, is that we just got to put more pressure on Russia. That's the big problem. Trump hadn't been putting enough pressure on because that'll bring Putin to his knees. I want to show you a video that was released in Russia. It was actually released this morning, but it was on the 30th, where Putin was talking to actually a group of children in Russia, but he's explaining to them the core of who Russia is and how much they're willing to sacrifice.
When I said that this is a holiday for practically every one of our families, it is only natural because with such enormous losses, 27 million people for the entire Soviet Union, the exact number still not fully counted, it is clear that nearly every family was affected. And it is extremely important to use modern opportunities to convey this information, this truth about the past, in this case, about the Great Patriotic War and its heroes, to pass it on to both today and tomorrow. Only by understanding the price at which our today and our tomorrow were secured, only by grasping the cost and the deeds of our ancestors, our fathers, grandfathers, even great-grandfathers, grandmothers, in defending the motherland, only by realizing the sacrifice it entailed, can we comprehend who we are, where we came from, and what our country truly is.
See that? I mean, he's saying something that other experts I've talked to said that's not just for show. That's what he actually believes, and certainly the historical record is black and white. That the Russians have suffered egregiously in the past, and yet they don't take their eye off of their objectives when they feel it's an existential threat. So do you think that issues like these with this F-16 deal, air defense, and these other kind of things are going to pressure Putin into changing his objectives?
Oh, obviously not. When I was in Moscow in 2001, in the NKVD archives, those are the archives of the secret police, were still open. I was told by members of the General Staff College that briefed us that they had counted 39,900,000 dead and were still counting. So I think the numbers are far worse than what President Putin mentioned. And in fact, to his credit, he said they were still counting. It's a tragedy on a scale that we cannot even begin to imagine. But throughout Russian history, certainly going back to the 10th century, when you have this Russian state that forms around initially what we call the Kievan Rus and the principalities that spring from all of that, the Russians have always fought to retain their freedom of action. In other words, to ensure that they were not blackmailed, that they were not actively suppressed or harmed. And remember, they went through Mongol invasions and Mongol occupations that lasted for 3 centuries. I don't think most Americans can even begin to imagine what that was like, nor should they at this point. But my basic point is that President Putin is not going to allow Russia to be bullied into a corner. And that's why Russia has built bridges, not only to China, but to the global south, to nations in the Middle East, in the Near East, the Indian subcontinent, Latin America. All of these bridges are for a reason, as an alternative to dependence upon, and particularly to avoid the bullying of the West. That's what he's about. He doesn't want Russia to be dependent upon us. He doesn't want Russia to be bullied by us. And unfortunately, this latest decision to send more military aid to Ukraine just reinforces the wisdom of his strategy to date. So there's no chance, no possibility whatsoever of Russia breaking under the pressure of sanctions or this other nonsense. What is far more serious, in my judgment, will be the readiness of the Russians to respond very, very violently towards us in the future, in other places, and particularly, I think, in the Middle East and about Iran.
You know, one thing, Doug, I think we have to admit is that as strong as the administration, I mean, it was everywhere from Trump himself, Rubio, the Vice President Vance, a couple of almost 3 weeks ago, where they really started saying this is Biden's war. We just want it to end. We could be walking within days. We had Tammy Bruce last week say that we are no longer going to be the mediators, and we're rapidly approaching the point where we're not going to do anything else, et cetera, to now all of a sudden backtracking here. And I'm going to show you something in just a second that he also said in that same interview on Sunday. Frankly, it's looking a lot like that Zelensky has been more effective at getting Trump to come over to his side than for Trump to lay down the law and tell him, here's how it's going to be. The latest point is, here's what Trump said regarding sanctions yesterday.
Your close ally, Senator Lindsey Graham, has a sanctions bill against Russia. If you get to that point, Mr. President, where you're prepared to walk away, will you sign that sanctions bill?
Well, it depends on whether or not Russia is behaving toward coming to a peace. We want a peace deal. We want Russia and Ukraine to agree to a deal.
Mm-hmm. So you think you're close to a deal? What will Russia have to give up? Because Ukraine, there's been discussions they will have to give up some of the land.
Russia will have to give up all of Ukraine. because that's what they want.
All of Ukraine, meaning they wouldn't keep any of the land that they've claimed?
Russia would have to give up all of Ukraine, because what Russia wants is all of Ukraine. And if I didn't get involved, they would be fighting right now for all of Ukraine. Russia doesn't want the strip that they have now. Russia wants all of Ukraine. And if it weren't me, they would keep going. Do you know?
Yeah, I don't know that that was ever Russia's primary objective, but if we keep going down this path, that may come to pass.
The kindest thing I can think of is to say that the man is deluded. And he's placing himself and our country on a path to war with a state that's not our enemy. Now, that is gratifying to someone like Lindsey Graham, who watches his reelection campaign and private accounts fill up with money because he's an advocate for war in the Middle East against Iran and the whole world on behalf of Israel. And he's an advocate for war with Russia come what may. But that's not in the interest of the American people. The American people haven't signed up for body bags and a busted budget, financial Armageddon. The Americans want peace and prosperity. They want peace abroad and prosperity at home. He doesn't seem to understand that. We all thought that he did, which is why large numbers of us voted for him. But he appears to be extremely confused. And frankly, he's lost the bubble. So I can't expect anything to happen now. Russia is certainly not going to suddenly say, oh, please, President Trump, you're a great man, and we want to be your friend. We'll do whatever you say. That's nonsense. We've got to get out of this. He's still stuck in 1990. You know, remember, Washington is really Versailles on the Potomac. But as I look at Versailles in 1789, frankly speaking, whatever their problems, they were more in touch with reality than Washington, D.C. is.
And if you need any more proof of what you just said, especially on the Russian side, you know, there's a couple of recent news items I want to put up. This I think it was exactly a week ago in Brazil, Sergei Lavrov laid out the conditions that he would say this is what's necessary. And the New York Post wrote that they thought they were astonished at it. And they said Russia shamelessly demanded that the U.S. lift its sanctions and that Kiev be demilitarized. And they should also have added denazified, because those were specifically stated by Lavrov, and recognize that 20% of Ukraine belongs to a Vladimir Putin-led nation, as it refused President Trump's push for peace. Then it says Foreign Minister Lavrov insisted Monday that Russia will accept nothing less than total victory over Ukraine. Then there was a separate article out there where it was talking about on the Russian, one of their military discussion boards, where they say that a truth along the existing line, or rather along the proposed line, that since Moscow, Kiev, and Washington present is differently, guaranteed to be unstable. The best option for a truce is the withdrawal of the armed forces of Ukraine to the Dnieper River. This is really, really important. They're not talking just about what used to be the June 14 conditions, where it was going to be the 4 administrative borders. Now that most in Russia are talking about the minimum line is the Dnieper River. How do you read those two comments?
From the beginning, when the Ukrainians, walked away from the negotiations in Istanbul, every astute observer said the same thing. The longer Ukraine waits to negotiate an end to the conflict, the more territory Ukrainians will lose, and the more people will be needlessly killed. Well, that prophecy has come true. There is no particular reason at this point, given the visceral hatred and hostility of the people in Kiev for Russia and Moscow, to negotiate anymore. I mean, frankly, as a Russian viewing the regime that's in Kiev right now, why would the Russians negotiate at all with them? Setting aside whether or not they're actually legitimate, and I have serious doubts about that with regard to Zelensky, it's a regime that cannot be reformed. It can't be changed. So that means it has to be destroyed. So I think that's the road that we're on right now. And it's odd to me that anyone would think, particularly President Trump, that he in Washington, thousands of miles away, is in a position, militarily, economically, politically, to impose a solution on the Russians. It doesn't make any sense. It's impossible. You know, it reminds me of the end of the Second World War. There were lots of people, and with good reason, that were extremely upset with Stalin's conquest of Eastern Europe. But privately, FDR admitted there was not a damn thing we could do about it. There were 15 million Soviet troops, and we were not in a position to launch a new war. So I think we're in a position that's not too dissimilar from that, except that this time the enemy is not Stalin. Russia is not a communist state. Russia is not our sworn enemy by any stretch of the imagination. Russia is a potential friend and ally if we're willing to cultivate it, which could be very helpful to us in the Middle East and in Asia and other places where we have other interests. We have a bad habit of being myopic. Somebody once said to me years ago when I was serving in the War Plans Division of the Army Staff in the 1990s, said, you know, Doug, Washington is a one crisis, one conflict town. I think there's a lot of truth in that. We just don't have a coherent strategy. So we don't look through the lens of our interests in the various regions. We simply treat everything that is different from us or diverges from us as the enemy. And so we keep multiplying the enemies, but we resolve nothing. And I think that's what's happened in Ukraine. We haven't resolved anything because we've decided to treat Russia as the enemy. Essentially, we're the Biden administration with a new face on it. And that's very disappointing. And I don't think that's what we voted for.
Yeah, that's I've seen more and more analogies coming in to say that this seems like Biden 2.0, at least in how it's turning out with regard to the Russia war. I want to look at a different aspect of this, and there has been increasing strident comments from Zelensky, whom you mentioned a second ago, over the last several days, giving more and more implied threats that he may launch strikes against Moscow on May the 9th. What do you think? First of all, do you think that that's just posturing? And secondly, if he tries to do it, what kind of action might the Russians have?
I would not dismiss it as posturing. Unfortunately, he has still received missiles and launchers that could enable him to strike at Moscow and other Russian cities. I don't think there's any question about that. This is one of the reasons why President Trump has missed such an historic opportunity to develop better relations with the Russians and normalize our relations, because we've ignored this man Zelensky as a dangerous, hostile, irresponsible actor on the world stage. He is a danger to us. He is a danger to the Russians. He's a danger to Europe. Russia has no interest in invading Europe. That's a lot of nonsense. Russia does not want all of Ukraine. They know their own country very, very well, and they understand that the people in Western Ukraine don't want to be Russians. They aren't Russians, and they don't want to be ruled by Russians. This was essentially Alexander Solzhenitsyn's message. The Russians needed to give up the empire, to drop all of these non-Russians inside their country and essentially become a Russian state as opposed to a multinational conglomerate held together by force. So he doesn't want to do that. He's a follower of Alexander Solzhenitsyn. He would like to have good relations with the Ukrainians, whom he views as Orthodox Christian Slavic brothers. But we've made that almost impossible because of our support for the worst elements in Ukraine at this time. So I think it's a real threat. And if it is carried out, if it's done, almost anything is possible for the Russians. I mean, for them, as you've just pointed out in his discussion of the importance of this holiday to the Russian national identity and survival that he was discussing with the children, then you can imagine almost anything happening. Now, I think the last thing that he wants is to use a nuclear weapon. That's not something he wants to do. And frankly, why would he? Because Ukraine is right on his border. You don't want to use nuclear weapons on your borders under any and all circumstances if you can avoid it. So I don't think that's the case. But just about anything else shy of a nuclear strike is eminently possible.
And in fact, speaking of the possibility of a nuclear strike, there was a documentary that was just released in Russia. I think it was just yesterday on the 25 years of Putin's service to the country, et cetera. And so they just released it. And part of that, he was asked specifically about nuclear weapons.
И вы же правильно сказали, нас хотели спровоцировать, хотели добиться того, чтобы мы совершили ошибки. Ну и не было необходимости применять оружие, о котором вы сейчас сказали. И, надеюсь, и не потребуется. У нас достаточно сил, средств для того, чтобы довести начатое в 2022 году до логического завершения с нужным для России результатом.
So a couple of things in there. Number one, that he mentioned specifically, we will accomplish our needs as we see them by whatever means, and we have the conventional needs to have it. And I perceive, and I'd like your opinion on this, that he made that comment that, well, we didn't need to use nuclear weapons in 2022, and in the future, I hope we don't, where he certainly didn't categorically deny it. And one wonders if they continue rolling on to the Dnieper River beyond these 4 oblasts, as that one Russian military site noted, that there will be at least a temptation in the West to say, hey, we may use tactical nuclear weapons if you keep coming to the West. How do you see that dynamic play out?
Listen, only a lunatic on either side would suggest the use of a nuclear weapon. So I'm sorry. Because there's no such thing as a tactical nuclear weapon. We talk about this all the time. Well, it's only 5 kilotons. It's only 9 kilotons. If you use a nuclear weapon against a nuclear armed power, the probability of rapid escalation is about 100%. Because your assumption is that the next thing that comes your way is an intercontinental ballistic missile attack. Why wait for it? So you would be inclined under those circumstances to launch first. Now, I don't think President Putin, and by the way, I don't think President Trump, neither of these men are remotely interested in using nuclear weapons. But I think what he's trying to say is that we are going to defend ourselves. We're going to defend our country. We're going to defend what is ours. I think we would do the same thing. We're very fortunate that we have not had foreign armies encroaching on our borders. Certainly not since Santa Anna in 1836. And I suspect that, we won't see any in the near future. But that's not necessarily the case with Russia. And so I think he was simply pointing out that the capabilities exist and the readiness to act in accordance with the interests of the Russian state's survival are clear and unambiguous. He will do what's necessary. I don't think there's any surprise in any of that.
Well, let's hope that even in this insane world that we have, that there's not that level of insanity on the Western side. And certainly there's no evidence that there's any insanity on the Russian side. Let's hope that continues to pass through. In the remaining time we have here, I want to shift gears real quick. You mentioned at the top of the show and a couple of times in between about some of the situation unfolding in the Middle East with Israel today announcing that they're going to now completely conquer the Gaza Strip. I'm not sure what 19 months didn't allow them to do it. I don't know why they think it's going to work this time. But something a little bit more even disturbing was released out by U.S. Senator Fetterman, who, Gary, if you can toss that up there, he tweeted this out and said that we cannot negotiate with Iran. It's time to destroy their nuclear program and neutralize the remaining capabilities in its prophecy. I am steadfast with Israel. Provide whatever is necessary to carry this out. And by the way, that whole thing was prompted by an article that he posted from Reuters, which says that Iran will strike back if U.S. or Israel attack, meaning they'll defend themselves. And the audacity, apparently, with that makes him think that, yeah, we just need to destroy them. What do you say to that?
Well, I think this is the sort of thinking about war that would give great comfort to Stalin or Hitler. They waged wars of annihilation. We Americans have historically not done that. We did not annihilate the Confederacy. We defeated it. We did not murder everyone in the Confederacy or everyone who was a Confederate. We did not ultimately intend to do as much damage as we did in Germany or Japan. We went beyond the pale and we did too much damage, which resulted in us having to fill the strategic vacuum for 50 years after World War II, because we'd done so much damage to Japan and Germany, the natural counterbalance to the Soviet Union. It's disappointing, but Senator Fetterman, and there has to be truth in advertising, is Jewish. I think all of the Jewish senators and congressmen, with the exception of our friend Bernie Sanders, are absolutely violent advocates for Zionism. I haven't run into any that weren't. And it's disturbing to me that they would argue for a war of annihilation against any of Israel's enemies as a matter of course, and as something that we as Americans should support. I mean, the problem with what's happening in the Middle East today is that we are not assisting Israel in its defense of its territory. We are underwriting and supporting this Greater Israel Project, which is designed to expand the territory of Israel. Now, I don't know if that means that once this is over and they manage to march all the way to the Nile, absorb at least half of Syria, including Damascus and southern Lebanon, and presumably parts of Jordan, that more Jews will show up so that they will have a population larger than the 7 million or so that currently, or at least before the war, were in Israel. Perhaps that's the plan. But the point is, I don't think several hundred million Muslims, whether they are Turks or Persians or Arabs, are going to be very favorably disposed to that. So I don't know why we feel under any circumstances, we Americans, should support that. We're not defending Israel. We're essentially underwriting and supporting their regional military hegemony.
Well, and then there's a separate issue, which actually gets me a little bit more rankled even than that, is that here is an American senator recommending as you say, the annihilation of this opponent here, not because we're threatened, not because they have attacked us, not because there's any kind of mortal threat to the United States at all. In fact, it's just, he overtly says it's for the state of Israel. Why should we use the American military as a proxy force for Jerusalem? That to me is even more disturbing.
Well, I think the answer is because big donors, the billionaire class, have committed enormous funds to gain control of the United States government and the White House. Control in the sense that their candidates that they support, who support what the donors want, are now in charge. It's that simple. And so there sits Donald Trump, who is widely touted as the best friend Israel ever had. Just go back and listen to, I think it was Mark Levin, extol the virtues of this president who unconditionally supports whatever Israel wants to do. Or you can look at other examples on the Hill. The bottom line is, that's the answer to your question. That's why. Now, if you were to ask the American people what they really thought, I don't know what you would get for an answer, but I doubt seriously it would be in favor of a regional war in the Middle East. But the problem is twofold. First of all, most Americans, most of the time, as you know, Dan, don't pay much attention to what happens beyond the borders of the United States. They're busy trying to put food on the table, to keep their families safe, to hold a job. That's problem number one. Problem number two, those who do look carefully at these things are probably horrified, but they've ultimately voted for the people that are going to do exactly what they don't want. And again, this goes back to President Trump. There was President Trump, who ran for office, made a number of critical promises, which won enormous support. And now there's President Trump in office, who is behaving very differently and is surrounded by a very different group of people from what we would have originally imagined.
You know,
That's
I would
the
like
only way
to,
I could explain it.
I would love to hear from the family members, the wives, the husbands, the parents, the brothers, sisters of the Americans that are currently pointlessly, I'll add, stationed throughout the Middle East, especially in some of these outposts in Syria and Iraq. that are extremely vulnerable to any kind of ballistic missile coming from Iran. In the event, and they have, by the way, expressly claimed that if we go to war with them, those bases will be targeted. And our air defense simply cannot stop the level of attacks that could come from there. We don't have it. It's tactical only, not strategic. How many of those families would say, sure, sacrifice my son or daughter, my American service member, for the habit, so that Israel, who already has nuclear weapons and can defend itself without any help, that will support something like that? I mean, it's beyond the pale, and it angers me as a veteran, and probably does you too, that the lives of our troops are not even considered in this. Nowhere did Fetterman worry about the potential cost to our troops that we claim to love.
Well, I think Fetterman represents large numbers of people on the Hill. I mean, truthfully, they may say thank you for your service, but they feel contempt for the people that do it. I don't think that's true for President Trump, and I know for a fact that he's always been very concerned by the vulnerability of the forces that we have on the ground. That's one of the reasons he's directed the withdrawal from Syria. Now, I leave it to you and others, Dan, to tell us whether or not he's actually pulled the troops out, because we know that President Trump in the past gave orders to remove forces from an area, and those forces never left. So I don't know what the facts on the ground are, but he directed the withdrawal of U.S. forces from Syria. He ought to get them out of Iraq. There's no reason for them to be there. There hasn't been for a long time, and the Iraqi government wants them to leave. And I think we're going to discover increasingly that our forces in Jordan, and we do have troops in Jordan, are at risk because that government is very fragile, and it's not quite clear what would happen in the event of a larger war to our forces there. The bottom line is, I do know that Trump cares about those things, but I'm rather unconvinced that the majority of people on the Hill are knowledgeable or care. It's callous for me to say that, but I've been looking at this now, certainly since I left the Army, for about 20 years. And even before I left, I began to see a lot of evidence for this. There's much less concern than there should be.
Yeah, totally agree with that. Listen, I know you're pressed for time here a little bit. Before we let you go, can you tell us a little bit about the first episode of McGregor that recently aired? How did that go, and then where can people go to watch the rest of these episodes?
Well, you can see this on YouTube, any of a number of different outlets, Rumble, X. It's out there. It went very well. It seems to have done well. It's piling up views, despite the fact that, of course, it's subject to the algorithms that YouTube creates to suppress people they don't like. And unfortunately, the message that we represent, which is obviously, as you and I have been discussing, an America First message, a real American First message, is not popular on YouTube. So we have to fight our way through that. And we're getting a lot of inquiries now from other networks. We'll see how it goes. We're on to our next episode, which should be out in about 10 days to 2 weeks, and that's on war. It's very much about what you and I are discussing right now. And then the next episode beyond that is a discussion of the so-called moral compass. Does the nation have one?
That'll be one question I want to watch.
Yeah. So thanks very much for bringing that up. I appreciate it. And I hope people will look for it. And I know that you've posted a link to it. And I think everybody that's seen it, with very few exceptions, have been complimentary.
Yeah, I thought it was great. I mean, it's really well produced, and obviously talking about issues that nobody else is talking about. I was really impressed with it. Thought it was great, and recommend everybody go watch it.
Well, thanks very much, Dan. And you're right. I got to go.
Very good. All right. Thanks, Doug. We'll see you later, and we will see you guys next time on the Daniel Davis Deep Dive. Thanks so much.
Right.